1,000 years of monarchy, and they still haven't figured out how not to embarrass themselves. From love-struck kings torching their thrones to royals who couldn't spell their own names. This isn't history. It's a slow-motion faceplant in ermine robes. These are the scandals too weird to be tragic and too dumb to be forgotten. So buckle up your coronation robes and hide the silverware, because we're diving into 25 of the dumbest royal scandals in British history. Spoiler, it's not the dignity that survived, it's the damage. Before we dive headfirst into royal ridiculousness, make sure you're subscribed. It helps the channel survive longer than some of these royal marriages. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what ungodly hour is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Texas? We won't judge. We're all up late for the same reason. Royal chaos. 1. Edward VIII and the abdication. Over Wallis Simpson. Once upon a deeply awkward time in 1936, a king of England fell so catastrophically in love with the wrong woman, he decided the best course of action was to set the monarchy on fire and walk away. That king was Edward VIII, and the woman was Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite with an allegedly magnetic personality and a dangerously inconvenient passport. To say this was controversial is like saying the Titanic had a bit of a leak. Let's set the scene. Edward wasn't your typical royal. He was charismatic, charming, and profoundly allergic to responsibility. While most monarchs tolerate protocol like a bad in-law, Edward seemed to actively resent the entire concept of monarchy. The only thing he took seriously, besides his wardrobe, was Wallis. Their relationship was already well known in aristocratic circles by the time Edward became king in January of 1936. Wallis had not yet finalized her second divorce, but Edward was already introducing her to family members, bringing her to royal functions, and, most scandalously, hinting that he intended to marry her. Cue the horrified gasps of the British establishment and the champagne corks popping in every tabloid editor's office. This wasn't just a matter of royal snobbery. In the 1930s, the Church of England, of which Edward, awkwardly, was now the supreme governor, didn't allow the remarriage of divorced persons if their ex-spouses were still alive. And Wallis had not one but 2 living exes. Edward's proposal wasn't just bad taste. It was a constitutional crisis wearing a fur stole. The British government was mortified. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin essentially told Edward, "You can be king, or you can have Wallis. Pick one." For a brief moment, Edward tried to negotiate. Maybe Wallis could be his consort, but not queen? Maybe a morganatic marriage, where she'd be his wife but hold no royal titles? The government said no. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, said absolutely not. Even his own family, steeped in scandal as they were, stared back at him with that uniquely royal mix of condescension and horror. And so, less than a year into his reign, Edward chose love, or lust, or codependence, depending on how romantic you're feeling. On December 11, 1936, he addressed the nation via radio. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." It was the royal equivalent of, "It's not you, it's me," only delivered with perfect diction and world-historic consequences. The abdication shocked the world. No British monarch had ever voluntarily stepped down like this before. It was more than just a romantic gesture. It was a seismic jolt to the monarchy's self-image. Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor and promptly exiled himself to France, where he married Wallis the following year in a ceremony no one from his family attended. His brother, now King George VI, took the throne, reportedly with the enthusiasm of a man agreeing to babysit a haunted house. But what made this scandal so dumb, so spectacularly, eye-wateringly unnecessary, was that it was entirely self-inflicted. Edward wasn't forced out by enemies or scandalized by public outrage. He walked out the front door, head held high, for a woman who would later describe herself as not in love with him and spent the rest of their marriage trapped in a sort of emotionally arid, jewel-encrusted purgatory. Worse, Edward and Wallace didn't even make good use of their freedom. They lived a relatively dull socialite life in exile, laced with awkward visits to Nazi Germany, more on that in a moment, and endless resentment toward the royal family. Edward spent decades sulking about the crown he gave up, attending parties where people whispered behind his back that he'd traded a kingdom for cocktails and mediocre company. And the real kicker? Wallace wasn't even universally adored. Much of high society found her grating, vain, and socially climbing. The British public never warmed to her. The couple became cautionary tales in couture. Historians still debate whether their love story was romantic or just deeply dysfunctional cosplay with state consequences. But if Edward thought abdicating would let him and Wallace live happily ever after, he underestimated one thing: the press never lets go of a scandal that juicy, especially when the sequel involves Nazis. 2. Prince Edward, Duke of Windsor, and the 1937 tour of Germany. After Edward VIII abdicated and became the Duke of Windsor, you might assume he'd lean into a quiet life of retirement. Long lunches, small scandals, maybe the occasional grumble about the family Christmas card. But no, Edward did something even worse than leaving the throne for love. He left the throne and then promptly tried to redeem his public image by touring Nazi Germany in 1937, just before World War II, with Wallace Simpson by his side and a suitcase full of deeply questionable judgment. To be fair, if we're being painfully generous, this was technically a private visit. But nothing is private when your face has been on every newspaper on 2 continents. Certainly not when you're shaking hands with Adolf Hitler in front of cameras, looking like the opening act to a geopolitical nightmare. Let's rewind. By 1937, Edward was bored. The abdication had cost him not only the throne, but the one thing he loved even more than Wallace: attention. In exile in France, he and Wallace were well-dressed pariahs, stylish but politically toxic, like a luxury handbag filled with anthrax. The royal family was icing him out. The public had mixed feelings, and Edward, in the classic style of men with too much time and not enough self-awareness, decided the best move was to stay relevant by being controversial. Enter Germany. At this point, Hitler was still pretending to be a respectable statesman. The war hadn't started yet, but the warning signs were flashing like a Vegas billboard. The Nazis were openly anti-Semitic, aggressively nationalistic, and quietly preparing for war. Most European royals wanted nothing to do with it. Edward, meanwhile, seemed intrigued, so he and Wallace accepted an invitation to tour Germany, not as official representatives of Britain, of course. The government made that abundantly clear, but as curious visitors, which, in royal terms, is like saying you're just asking questions while holding hands with a dictator. The tour included the usual pomp: salutes, parades, factory tours. But it was the symbolism that really sold the scandal. Edward saluted Nazi troops. He inspected German youth brigades. He visited factories making materials for war. And he had a private meeting with Hitler at Berghof, the Führer's mountaintop retreat. According to various reports, the meeting was disturbingly cordial. Hitler allegedly found Wallace charming. Edward, for his part, seemed impressed. The whole thing had the vibe of a deeply cursed honeymoon. Photographs of the visit circulated in the press. Edward smiling beside swastikas, tipping his hat to Nazi officers, surrounded by men who, within 2 years, would plunge Europe into a 6-year bloodbath. The British government was apoplectic. The public? Mortified. This wasn't just a misstep. It was a full-on diplomatic pratfall, the kind that makes historians wince even 80 years later. Why did he do it? That's the question, isn't it? Some say Edward was naive, politically illiterate, and simply didn't grasp the implications. Others believe he harbored sympathy for fascist ideas, not necessarily because of ideology, but because he disliked the British establishment and liked the idea of a powerful, orderly state. There's even been speculation, some from declassified documents, that the Nazis viewed Edward as a potential puppet king in the event of a successful invasion of Britain. Whether Edward knew or encouraged this remains murky. What isn't murky is the damage. Edward's Nazi flirtation deepened the royal family's mistrust of him. He would never again be given any real responsibility. For the rest of his life, he would exist in a limbo of faded glamour and deep suspicion, photographed often, trusted by no one. Wallis, who once aspired to be queen, found herself married to a man whose legacy was mostly tabloid fodder and State Department headaches. The irony, of course, is that Edward might have thought this visit would rehabilitate him, show the world he was still relevant, still influential. Instead, it permanently labeled him as the royal who couldn't read the room, the century, or the swastika-laden backdrop behind him. And in the end, it turned out that his greatest scandal wasn't abdicating the throne. It was what he did afterward. Love made him leave, but ego made him dangerous. And no matter how sharp his suits were, Edward would never again be taken seriously by anyone in power. The Duke of Windsor spent the rest of his life abroad, attending minor parties, occasionally writing letters to his brother asking for more money, and reflecting, perhaps, on the cost of being history's best-dressed cautionary tale. Still, there are worse ways to be remembered in royal history, though none quite as acoustically humiliating as the royal scandal that leaked through a telephone line. And if you're still with us after that royal detour through fascist fanboy tourism, now's the perfect time to hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting warmed up. Let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? Are you doom scrolling at 2 a.m. in Berlin, half awake in Jakarta, or just pretending to work in an open office? No judgment. We're all here for the same mess. 3. Charles III and the Tampongate phone tape leak. If the British monarchy were a reality show, and honestly, it often feels like one, then Tampongate would be its most mortifying episode. Picture it. The year is 1993, the Cold War is over, the internet is just waking up, and the British royal family is imploding in slow motion. Prince Charles, heir to the throne, is separated from Princess Diana but not yet divorced. The tabloids are circling like caffeinated vultures. Then, one chilly January day, a secret recording surfaces. A phone call. Intimate, rambling, and catastrophically human. And in the middle of it, a phrase that would haunt Charles forever. The wish, uttered mid-flirtation, that he might live inside his lover Camilla Parker Bowles as a tampon. It's hard to overstate how much this destroyed the illusion of royal mystique. The monarchy has survived wars, beheadings, and Netflix dramas, but what it wasn't built to survive was the image of its future king muttering awkward pillow talk about feminine hygiene products. Let's rewind to the origin story of this unintentional Shakespearean farce. Back in 1989, Charles and Camilla were rekindling an affair that had never truly ended. Their relationship, already complex and heavily whispered about, existed in that nebulous zone of emotional adultery. Both were married, both unhappy, both convinced that destiny, or at least nostalgia, was on their side. The call took place one evening while Charles was staying at Sandringham, and Camilla was at her home. It was one of those long, meandering conversations that only make sense between two people who have known each other too long. They laughed, they sighed, they shared small domestic details. And then, in a moment of unfortunate verbal creativity, Charles said something he could never unsay. Years later, when the recording leaked, no one was quite sure who'd done it. The official line was that the call had been intercepted by amateur radio enthusiasts who stumbled onto the frequency and, instead of doing the decent thing and turning the dial, hit record. Whether that's true or just convenient myth, the result was the same. The tape was copied, sold, and distributed like royal contraband. In a world before social media, it spread through newspapers, tabloids, and whispered office jokes. By the time it hit the front page of the Mirror, it wasn't just a scandal. It was a cultural event. The public reaction was a mix of disbelief, laughter, and genuine discomfort. Britons who'd grown up thinking of their royals as stiff, dignified, and vaguely robotic suddenly had to process that their future king was, in fact, a middle-aged man capable of the world's least sexy improvisation. Late-night hosts and pub-goers had a field day. Tampon jokes became a national pastime. Even now, decades later, the word alone can trigger an instinctive wince in anyone over 40. The palace, of course, went into lockdown mode. Official statements were non-existent. Courtiers denied nothing, confirmed nothing, and looked visibly aged by the experience. Diana, already privately humiliated by Charles's affair, found herself in the cruel position of watching the man who'd hurt her become the butt of every tabloid headline. The monarchy, still reeling from other family embarrassments, seemed suddenly fragile, more soap opera than sovereign institution. But the irony of Tampongate lies not just in its absurdity, but in its longevity. Charles survived it. Camilla did too. Over time, public disgust dulled into awkward acceptance, then begrudging sympathy, and finally, astonishingly, respect. The two eventually married in 2005, outlasting every critic, every comedian, every newspaper caricature. What was once scandalous became domestic. What was once humiliating became history. And yet, the shadow lingers. Every time Charles faces a PR crisis, someone inevitably mentions the tape. It has become shorthand for royal vulnerability, for that fleeting, painful moment when the monarchy's curtain fell and revealed two middle-aged lovers whispering nonsense into the night. There's a strange tenderness buried in the embarrassment. For all its stupidity, the call captured something undeniably human. The absurd language of affection, the vulnerability of intimacy, the way love makes even kings ridiculous. It was dumb, yes, but it was also real. And that's why it stuck. Still, for Charles, the lesson was clear. When you live your life surrounded by microphones, you might want to keep your metaphors strictly metaphorical. Unfortunately, the royals don't learn fast, because just when the monarchy thought it had hit rock bottom in PR disasters, another prince decided to go on live television to explain in exquisite detail why he couldn't sweat and what he was doing at Pizza Express. 4. Prince Andrew. I was at Pizza Express interview. In the long crowded hall of royal missteps, where scandal is a family pastime and poor judgment is practically ceremonial, one entry shines with a uniquely modern kind of absurdity. It's not historical. It's not subtle. It's Prince Andrew's 2019 interview with the BBC, the one that should have cleared his name but instead became an instant case study in how not to handle a PR crisis. It was supposed to be a moment of clarity. Instead, it was a televised car crash in slow motion. To understand how we got here, you have to understand Andrew, the Duke of York, the Queen's second son, and a man long known for his military service, lavish lifestyle, and impeccable ability to step on every diplomatic rake in sight. Throughout the years, he's been labeled Air Miles Andy for his globe-trotting excesses and was often the royal family's unofficial ambassador to wealthy people with questionable track records. He was already a walking tabloid magnet. And then came his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein, the disgraced financier, had a network of connections that included the rich, powerful, and deeply compromised. Prince Andrew was among them. Their association dated back to the 1990s, and by the early 2000s, they were seen together at dinners, on private jets, and, infamously, walking through New York's Central Park in 2010, after Epstein's first conviction. That photo, in particular, haunted Andrew like a bad cologne. But the real scandal came later, when one of Epstein's accusers named Prince Andrew specifically. The palace, in crisis mode, decided something had to be done. Andrew needed to clear the air, correct the record, defend himself in a calm, rational, gentlemanly way. so naturally they agreed to a one-on-one televised interview on Newsnight with veteran journalist Emily Maitlis, a woman known less for fluff pieces and more for eviscerating her subjects with polite, forensic precision. What followed was one of the most unintentionally surreal royal performances of all time. The interview aired in November 2019. The goal was simple: deny the allegations, express remorse for the friendship with Epstein, and present oneself as a serious royal attempting to do the right thing. What happened instead was an Olympic-level display of foot-and-mouth syndrome. First, there was the infamous sweating claim. In trying to disprove a key element of the accuser's account, Andrew offered this gem, that it couldn't have been him dancing with a woman in a London club in 2001 because, due to a specific medical condition resulting from his time in the Falklands War, he couldn't sweat. Yes, that was the defense. A temporary loss of sweat glands. Millions of viewers blinked at their screens in collective disbelief. Then came the alibi. On the night in question, Andrew claimed he wasn't in London. No, he was in Woking, a commuter town, and not just anywhere in Woking. He was at Pizza Express with his daughter, at a children's party. The specificity was meant to lend credibility. It had the opposite effect. The idea that a high-ranking royal would recall with absolute clarity attending a child's pizza party on a random Saturday 18 years earlier raised more eyebrows than it closed. It wasn't exculpatory. It was bizarre, and it didn't stop there. Andrew repeatedly said he didn't regret his friendship with Epstein, only the fallout. He failed to express empathy for the victims. He looked smug, defensive, and oddly detached, as though he were being inconvenienced by reality itself. The public reaction was immediate and brutal. Within days, Andrew was mocked relentlessly across media platforms. The "I was at Pizza Express in Woking" line became an internet meme. Late-night hosts skewered him. Newspapers demanded accountability. More importantly, the palace was humiliated. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a communications catastrophe. Fallout came swiftly. Prince Andrew announced he was stepping back from public duties. Charities dropped him. Institutions distanced themselves. He became a royal ghost, technically still part of the family, but rarely seen, never heard, and politely omitted from most events. In a monarchy obsessed with dignity and control, Andrew had committed the cardinal sin. He had made the royals look ridiculous. Not corrupt, not cruel, just absurd. The entire ordeal raised bigger questions too, about privilege, accountability, and how the institution handles scandal in the digital age. But above all, it stood as proof that sometimes the damage isn't in the deed, it's in the denial. And while Andrew receded into the background, a different kind of royal embarrassment was brewing. Not the flashy, televised kind. No, the next scandal would be quieter, more banal, but possibly even dumber. Because nothing says the monarchy is in good hands like spelling the baby's name wrong on the official royal website. 5. The Sony-style royal family website. Typo errors. The British royal family, for all its centuries of pomp and circumstance, still struggles with one very modern invention: the internet. Specifically, their own website. You'd think that with a communications team funded by taxpayers and trained in the ancient arts of damage control, they'd at least be able to spell their own relatives' names correctly. But no, even in the digital age, the monarchy has proven that it can stumble not just over international diplomacy, but also over a keyboard. Enter what we'll politely call the royal website typo era, a series of avoidable, low-level, deeply embarrassing blunders that would make a part-time intern at a local council blush. If Tampingate was the scandal of overheard intimacy, and Pizza Express was the scandal of spoken absurdity, this was the scandal of royal misspellings. Proof, if anyone needed it, that even monarchy can be undone by Microsoft Word and poor proofreading. One of the most famous, read deeply mocked examples came in 2019 during the christening of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, the first child of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. This was already a tense time for the royal PR machine. The Sussexes had just made the radical decision to keep the event private, barring press and publishing only a few curated photographs afterward. The palace had to get everything just right. Naturally, they didn't. On the official website's caption under the family photo, a simple high-stakes moment meant to show unity and grace, the royal household listed Prince Harry's name incorrectly. Instead of his full royal style, they entered his name as if they'd Googled it 10 seconds before uploading. For a family obsessed with titles, protocol, and full names that sound like legal documents from the 1800s, it was an unforced error of hilarious proportions. But that wasn't the only incident. Over the years, the website has featured everything from incorrect job titles to wrong dates, broken links, and biographies that read like someone copied and pasted directly from Wikipedia and forgot to delete the footnotes. Once, a link meant to showcase Princess Eugenie's charity work redirected users to a page that didn't exist. A poetic metaphor, perhaps, for royal relevance in the 21st century. The phrase Sony style comes from a particularly galling moment when the royal website tried to list media credits and accidentally left in placeholder text, complete with a corporate-sounding blurb that mentioned Sony Music. The implication was that the site's developers were either copying from a commercial template or simply not paying attention, which, honestly, fits the pattern. Now, in fairness, everyone makes typos. But the royal family isn't everyone. They are a hereditary institution built on the illusion of perfection. Their entire brand is being polished, precise, and timeless, even when the personalities behind the curtain are chaotic at best. So when the official royal website misidentifies members of the family, it feels less like a technical glitch and more like a Freudian slip with an HTML extension. There's something deliciously ironic about an institution that takes such pride in ceremonial precision, the matching hats, the polished shoes, the 20-minute processions just to walk down a hallway, failing at basic spell check. It reminds us that behind the velvet curtain and military uniforms, these are people with laptops, coffee-fueled interns, and deadlines they probably forgot until 5 minutes before launch. The typos don't spark constitutional crises. They don't end marriages or trigger investigations. But they do chip away at the idea that the palace is in control. And that's where the real damage lies. Because if you can't trust the palace to correctly list your baby's name, how much faith are you supposed to have in them running a modern constitutional monarchy? Still, at least spelling mistakes are fixable. A red-faced aide can quietly update the website at 3 a.m. and pretend nothing happened. Not all royal blunders are so easily scrubbed. Some play out in full view of the courts, the tabloids, and society's elite. Like the time a prince got caught gambling in a scandalous card game that spiraled into legal drama and aristocratic finger-pointing. 6. George IV and the gambling royal baccarat scandal. Before he was King George IV, he was simply the Prince of Wales, and depending on your perspective, either the most flamboyantly stylish royal of the Georgian era or the human embodiment of a velvet-upholstered headache. He loved architecture, fashion, horses, and food, all in excessive quantities. But there was one vice that stood out, not just for its cost, but for its sheer absurd fallout. Gambling. This wasn't the kind of polite card table diversion you might expect from a royal in a powdered wig. George's gambling was epic, operatic, chronically ill-advised. He once wagered and lost the equivalent of several modern millions on a single card game. His debts were so astronomical that Parliament had to repeatedly bail him out, usually under the condition that he'd marry someone respectable and behave himself. He usually agreed to the former and immediately ignored the latter. But of all the missteps and money pits he created, none were quite as publicly humiliating, or dumb, as the infamous royal baccarat scandal of 1890. Yes, you read that right. 1890. That's the twist. George IV's gambling spirit haunted the monarchy even decades after his death. The actual scandal didn't directly involve him, but his great-nephew, the future King Edward VII. proving once again that poor judgment, like titles, often runs in the family. George IV set the tone. The rest of the royals simply followed the template. Here's what happened. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, was visiting the country estate of a friend, Arthur Wilson, when he and a group of aristocrats decided to play a late-night game of baccarat, a high-stakes card game that was technically illegal at the time under British law, at least in private homes. Among the players was Lieutenant Colonel Sir William Gordon Cumming, a dashing military officer with impeccable connections and a bit of a reputation for intensity. Over the course of 2 nights, a few members of the group suspected Gordon Cumming of cheating. Rather than confront him publicly, they pulled him aside and made him sign a written agreement never to play cards again, all in exchange for their silence. Problem solved, right? Not quite. Word leaked, it always does. Whispers became headlines, and Gordon Cumming, furious at the implication and the stain on his reputation, sued for defamation. The trial that followed was a media spectacle of the highest order. Royalty was dragged into court. The Prince of Wales, yes, the future king, was forced to testify in public, the first time an heir to the throne had taken the stand in 600 years. The courtroom was packed. The scandal was printed on every front page. The central question wasn't even whether someone had cheated at cards. It was whether a group of royals and aristocrats had tried to cover it up with a private, hushed agreement, only to be outmaneuvered by the very man they wanted to exile quietly. In the end, Gordon Cumming lost the case, but the damage was done, not to him, but to the monarchy. The prince came off as naive, clubbish, and careless. The whole affair painted Britain's elite as decadent and out of touch, men who played illegal games in the drawing rooms of their lavish estates, then closed ranks when things went sideways. And behind it all, the ghost of George IV lingered like an unpaid tab. It was his gambling legacy, the same one that had driven him into debt, into Parliament's courtroom, into one compromise after another, now living on in his descendants, who'd inherited not just his titles and estates, but his taste for high-stakes embarrassment. The absurdity of the whole episode was that it could have been avoided with one simple act, someone saying, maybe let's not cheat at cards with royalty present. Or at the very least, maybe don't sign shady agreements at midnight on someone else's estate. But restraint, as history has shown us, is not a particularly royal trait. Of course, when it comes to poor judgment, few monarchs ever self-sabotaged quite so completely, or so spectacularly, as Mary, Queen of Scots. Where George gambled at cards, Mary gambled with power, borders, and trust, and lost every time. 7. Mary, Queen of Scots. Embarrassing miscalculation of her position. If Shakespeare had invented Mary, Queen of Scots, we'd call it heavy-handed. A beautiful young queen raised in a foreign land, thrust into the cutthroat world of dynastic politics, only to be outmaneuvered at every turn by her older, colder cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But Mary wasn't fictional, she was real. And she didn't just get outplayed, she practically choreographed her own downfall with a series of baffling decisions so ill-advised, they make one wonder whether she was operating with a chessboard or a deck of Uno cards. Born in 1542 and crowned Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old, Mary was always a symbol before she was a strategist. She was raised in France, betrothed to the Dauphin, and for a brief, glittering moment, became Queen of France. But fate had other ideas. Her husband died young, and Mary returned to Scotland, still a queen, but now in a land she barely remembered, and over which she had only the loosest grip of power. It didn't take long for things to go sideways. Her first mistake? Marrying Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a decision that, even by 16th century standards, should have raised more red flags than a Tudor execution day. Darnley was handsome, sure, but also vain, ambitious, and utterly unreliable. He also happened to be her cousin, which was either a plus or a gross historical footnote, depending on how you interpret dynastic logic. Darnley quickly made himself unpopular. demanding the crown matrimonial and alienating everyone at court. Then he made the even worse decision of having Mary's trusted secretary, David Rizzio, murdered during dinner in front of her because he was jealous of their closeness. It was a political assassination staged like a soap opera, complete with screaming, blood, and betrayal. Mary, newly pregnant, watched it all unfold, and astonishingly, didn't send Darnley packing. Instead, she tried to patch things up. A few months later, Darnley was dead. The house he was staying in exploded, and his strangled body was found outside. Not a great look. Enter mistake number 2. Mary then married the man widely suspected of orchestrating Darnley's murder, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. The optics here were not subtle. Marrying your husband's probable killer tends to look suspicious, even in an age when murder was practically a royal pastime. Bothwell may have forced her into marriage, or maybe not. The records are murky, but the public backlash wasn't. Nobles turned on her. Support crumbled. Her rule fell apart like wet parchment. By 1567, Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. She fled to England seeking protection from her cousin, Elizabeth I, a woman who viewed Mary not as a royal equal, but as a Catholic threat to her Protestant throne. Which brings us to her final, fatal miscalculation. Mary believed that Elizabeth would support her, or at least shelter her, as a fellow queen. Instead, Elizabeth saw a rival and had her locked up in various castles and manors for the next 19 years. Mary wrote letters, plotted escapes, allegedly conspired in assassination plots. Whether she was innocent or not, her mere existence was dangerous. She was a banner for every Catholic rebellion. Eventually, Elizabeth signed her death warrant. Mary was executed in 1587, ending a life that began with crowns and ended with a blindfold and a prayer. But the tragedy of Mary, Queen of Scots, isn't just how she died, it's how badly she played the game. Her life reads like a masterclass in royal misjudgment, trusting the wrong men, marrying the worst ones, and expecting mercy from a woman whose survival depended on denying it. Mary was brilliant, beautiful, and charismatic, but her instincts for politics were catastrophically poor. She mistook charm for power, loyalty for security, and kinship for protection. Still, her story has echoed for centuries, not because she succeeded, but because she failed so magnificently. Few royals have self-destructed with such operatic flair, and yet, she still doesn't take the crown for the most publicly disastrous marriage in royal history. That honor likely belongs to Queen Caroline, whose union with George IV made Mary's look like a successful merger. 8. Caroline of Brunswick and the Royal Marriage Meltdown. If you've ever been to a wedding where the bride and groom clearly hate each other, just imagine that. Only televised, sanctioned by Parliament, and involving the future King of England. Caroline of Brunswick's marriage to George IV wasn't just a romantic disaster. It was a full-scale public debacle, a slow-motion implosion of royal dignity, dragged out over decades with all the elegance of a food fight in a formal dining hall. To begin with, George IV, then still the Prince of Wales, had no interest in marrying Caroline. In fact, he had already secretly, and illegally, married another woman, Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow. That marriage, although not recognized by law, was emotionally real to George. So when Parliament insisted he marry someone appropriate to settle his monstrous debts, which he racked up with the fervor of someone allergic to budgeting, Caroline was the unlucky European princess selected for the job. They met only days before the wedding. According to George, he was so repulsed by her on sight that he asked for a stiff drink, then drank himself into a stupor. Caroline, for her part, was unimpressed. She reportedly found him bloated, drunken, and overdressed. Romantic sparks? Non-existent. They were married anyway in 1795, and George was allegedly so intoxicated on the wedding night that he passed out in the fireplace. There was one conjugal interaction, just enough to produce an heir, Princess Charlotte, but otherwise they avoided each other like a plague ship. Within weeks, George moved back in with his mistress. Within months, he had written Caroline off completely. Caroline, banished from court, responded in kind. She took up residence at Blackheath, began entertaining various guests, and acted with just enough ambiguity to make the court whisper. George used this as an excuse to launch a full-blown smear campaign, accusing her of improper behavior, infidelity, and all manner of scandalous conduct. Most of it circumstantial, much of it wildly exaggerated. By 1806, things reached their first public boiling point with the delicate investigation. Yes, they actually called it that. Parliament assembled a panel to examine whether Caroline had committed adultery and whether the young child living with her, William Austen, was hers. The panel eventually ruled there wasn't enough evidence to charge her with anything, though her behavior was deemed inconsistent with her station. Translation: we can't prove anything, but we still don't like her. For a while the drama simmered in the background, but then George became king in 1820 and promptly tried to have Caroline legally stripped of her title and banned from the coronation. He didn't just dislike her, he wanted to erase her. This triggered what became known as the Pains and Penalties Bill, a proposed act of Parliament that would dissolve the marriage and accuse Caroline of adultery. The trial was a public spectacle, complete with dubious witnesses, salacious details, and newspaper headlines that would make modern tabloids blush. But public sympathy swung toward Caroline. She had become the underdog, the wronged wife fighting against a bloated, unpopular monarch. Crowds gathered in the streets chanting her name. She was the people's queen, if not the palace's. In the end, the bill failed. George was humiliated, but still refused to let Caroline attend the coronation. On the day of the ceremony in 1821, Caroline tried to enter Westminster Abbey. She was turned away, twice. A scene that should have symbolized unity became pure slapstick. The rejected queen banging on locked doors while her husband was being crowned inside, surrounded by forced smiles and stiff collars. Caroline died just weeks later, her health in decline and her reputation permanently fused to one of the ugliest marital sagas in royal history. Her final wish? To have "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England," inscribed on her coffin. Subtlety was not her strong suit. Still, in the long and storied history of royal relationship disasters, hers remains one of the most pitifully public. Yet somehow, it wasn't the most chaotic royal lifestyle on record. That honor likely goes to a sailor king who managed to father 10 illegitimate children, scandalize Parliament, and still make it to the throne. William IV, the monarchy's rowdiest seaman. 9. William IV, the Sailor King, a lifestyle scandal. If the British monarchy is an institution built on formality, restraint, and well-rehearsed decorum, then William IV was, at best, a reluctant participant, and at worst, the man who looked at the royal rulebook and used it to light his cigar. Long before he ascended the throne, William lived what might generously be called a colorful life, and less generously, a barely concealed social spectacle of rolling impropriety. Born in 1765 as the third son of George III, William had the rare privilege of being a prince with no immediate responsibilities. With his 2 older brothers ahead of him in the line of succession, no one really expected William to do much except exist, be vaguely present at state dinners, and not embarrass the family too frequently. Naturally, he did the exact opposite. He joined the Royal Navy at the age of 13, because apparently nothing says future king like teenage sea duty. The experience stuck, and for the rest of his life, he liked to remind people, loudly and constantly, that he was a sailor. This became his personal brand. Less refined monarch-in-waiting, more pub raconteur with a naval pension. Even after becoming king, he retained the blunt speech and coarseness of a man more comfortable at sea than on a throne. But what made William's pre-kingly life truly scandalous wasn't his sea stories. It was his domestic situation. Specifically, his 20-year relationship with the Irish actress Dorothea Jordan. She wasn't a noble, she wasn't a wife, but she was, very much, his partner. Together, they had 10 children, the Fitzclarences, all technically illegitimate, but publicly acknowledged and even lightly incorporated into royal social circles, to the confusion and horror of many. For 2 decades, William and Dorothea lived in quasi-domestic bliss, albeit in a setup that looked more like a theater troupe than a royal household. She continued acting to help support their family, while William, always a fan of not working too hard, enjoyed a relatively laid-back existence. The scandal wasn't just the number of children, it was the brazenness. Royals had mistresses, yes, but to play house with one so openly? That was bold, even by Georgian standards. Eventually, the royal family pressured William to break it off. He did, reluctantly and inelegantly, and married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen in 1818, a much younger, quiet, and politically acceptable woman. Their marriage was stable, but tragically childless. Still, Adelaide accepted William's past without much fuss, even helping raise some of his children from the Dorothea years. Publicly, she rehabilitated his image. Privately, she likely had the patience of a saint. When William unexpectedly became king in 1830, after the death of his older brother George IV, the nation braced itself. What kind of monarch would a lifelong libertine make? Surprisingly, a decent one, if you didn't mind unpredictability and the occasional outburst. William was pragmatic, constitutionally cooperative, and far less autocratic than his predecessors. He pushed for reform, disliked pomp, and often walked around town without an escort, much to the alarm of his guards. But his personal style never really evolved. He once tried to cancel his own coronation to save money. He often swore in public. He made awkward jokes during official speeches. And he treated the royal court like it was a particularly uptight dinner party he was being forced to attend. There's something almost endearing about William's refusal to take monarchy too seriously. But the scandal of his earlier years never fully faded. Parliament might have forgiven him. Society, less so. Today, William IV is one of those monarchs who mostly gets overlooked in history books. A transitional figure between the excesses of George IV and the austere might of Queen Victoria. But the chaos of his early life, his disregard for tradition, and his wild youth as a naval royal turned accidental heir make him a standout in royal misadventure. And speaking of accidental heirs and painful public gaffes, the next monarch in line would inherit a very different burden. Not scandalous illegitimacy or romantic rebellion, but something somehow even more awkward. The deeply avoidable timing of royal gaffes in the face of national anxiety. Enter George VI, the king who couldn't catch a break from his own nerves or the microphone. 10. George VI and the terrifyingly bad timing of royal gaffes. By all accounts, George VI was a reluctant king, and not in the usual aristocratic, "Oh fine, I suppose I'll accept the crown if I must" way. No, this was real reluctance. The kind steeped in personal anxiety, public performance dread, and a chronic speech impediment that made standing in front of a microphone feel like walking into a firing squad. He never wanted to be king. That job was meant for his older brother, Edward VIII, a man whose idea of duty was so allergic to effort that he abdicated the throne to marry an American divorcee and accidentally destabilized the monarchy in the process. George, or Bertie as he was known to friends and family, was the backup plan. The understudy thrust into the spotlight because the lead actor eloped mid-rehearsal. But while Bertie would ultimately be remembered as the steady wartime king, the stiff upper lip of Britain during the Blitz, his early years as monarch were riddled with a specific kind of royal embarrassment, the gaffe with the worst possible timing. The most famous of these, of course, was his struggle with public speaking. George VI suffered from a pronounced stammer, made worse by stress and national expectations. This might have gone unnoticed in a quieter era. Unfortunately, he became king just as radio broadcasts turned royal speeches into national events, and every pause, repetition, and breathless attempt to push through a sentence became painfully public. His coronation speech in 1937, for instance, was rehearsed endlessly with his speech therapist Lionel Logue, later immortalized in the King's Speech. And while the final result was brave, the lead-up was a masterclass in second-hand embarrassment. Microphones were tested repeatedly. Scripts were marked like wartime maps. Engineers and aides hovered nearby like nervous parents watching a toddler near a staircase. The issue wasn't just the stammer. It was that every time the country needed a rousing, confident declaration, Bertie delivered a slow, tentative stop-and-start affair that made everyone in the room tighten their shoulders in sympathetic panic. During World War II, these moments became more frequent. There was the time he accidentally referred to the Allies' military operations in a way that confused troop morale. Or when he tried to lighten a speech with a bit of self-deprecating humor and inadvertently made the public wonder if he actually understood the gravity of the war. None of these were intentional blunders. He wasn't careless. But his timing was often just off. Add to that the problem of royal visibility. George VI was determined to be seen as a present monarch, unlike his brother. So he insisted on visiting bombed-out neighborhoods, touring hospitals, and standing with his people, which, to his credit, he did, often in a fog of nervous energy, flanked by aides trying desperately to steer him away from cameras at just the wrong moments. One of the more unintentionally comic episodes came when he attempted to inspect a munitions factory and nearly wandered into an off-limits area, prompting a scramble by staff and an awkward photograph where the king appears halfway through a door he wasn't supposed to open. That image circulated widely, attached to headlines like, "King goes where he's needed," a generous interpretation of what looked more like accidental trespassing. His interactions with the press were equally nerve-wracking. He once mistook a reporter's question as a statement, nodded solemnly, and walked away, inadvertently implying royal endorsement of something he hadn't even heard. Court aides were left to smooth things over with vague statements like, "His Majesty's position remains under review." But to his credit, George VI never leaned into arrogance or blame. His mistakes were human, his efforts sincere. He wasn't scandalous. He was simply always one moment away from an awkward silence or an unfortunate soundbite. And in that, ironically, he was perhaps the most relatable monarch of them all. Yet while George VI's missteps were mostly sympathetic, they paved the way for the monarchy's next awkward chapter. One where power, politics, and petty favoritism collided in strange little corners of court. Because behind every sovereign, there's always a cast of supporting characters ready to stir the pot. And few stirred harder than Queen Anne's bewildering court of whispers and mismanagement. 11. Queen Anne. Weird court politics and personal mismanagement. Queen Anne's reign is often remembered for what others did in her name. She was the last of the Stuarts, the first monarch of a united Britain, and the royal figurehead during a period of war, scientific advancement, and political upheaval. But despite all that, she remained something of a tragicomic figure, a woman utterly consumed by the people around her, buried in personal grief, and occasionally upended by what can only be described as petty palace drama. Anne wasn't stupid. She was devout, loyal, and had flashes of emotional intelligence. But her biggest flaw, the one that defined her reign, was her absolute reliance on whoever happened to be her favorite that month. In Anne's court, loyalty didn't rise through competence or statesmanship. It rose through gossip, emotional manipulation, and the occasional passive-aggressive poem. Her most infamous relationship was with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, a brilliant, strong-willed woman who knew how to pull the strings of power like a seasoned puppeteer. Sarah wasn't just a friend. She was the friend, confidant, emotional anchor, and, at times, stand-in backbone for a queen who was deeply insecure and often unwell. For a while, this arrangement worked. Sarah's husband, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, was a military genius leading British forces in the War of the Spanish Succession. Sarah kept the Queen's court running and the political machine oiled. But then things got weird. Sarah, with her towering sense of superiority, eventually began treating Anne like a project, or worse, a dull relation in need of constant correction. She mocked Anne's devotion to religion, scolded her for her choices, and increasingly tried to micromanage her every move. Anne, tired of being treated like a child in her own palace, started to pull away. Enter Abigail Masham, Sarah's cousin and the living embodiment of every manipulative social climber in historical fiction. Where Sarah was brash, Abigail was demure. Where Sarah issued orders, Abigail whispered suggestions. She listened, she sympathized, and most importantly, she never told the Queen what to do. Anne, emotionally isolated and chronically ill, latched onto Abigail like a lifeboat in a sea of courtly contempt. This triggered a slow-motion political catastrophe. Sarah, enraged at being sidelined, began a smear campaign that would make modern tabloids blush. She accused Abigail of using her influence to rig court appointments, sway policy, and, in the most whispered and speculative tones, of sharing an intimacy with Anne that went beyond friendship. The idea of a romantic relationship between queen and servant was scandalous, but more importantly, it was politically dangerous. Whether there was any truth to it, and most historians lean toward no, the accusation was enough to destabilize the court. Anne, trapped between rival factions, tried to maintain control. But her increasing frailty, she suffered from gout, obesity, and a litany of ailments that kept her in near constant discomfort, made it easier for others to seize power by proximity. Her reign was marked by frequent cabinet reshuffles, sudden political reversals, and a sense that the Queen herself was more often reacting than ruling. All of this might have been manageable if not for Anne's tragic personal life. She was pregnant 17 times. 17. Only one child lived past infancy, and he died at age 11. The emotional toll was immeasurable. She governed from a place of grief, and that grief often translated into clinging to whoever made her feel safe, regardless of their qualifications. In the end, Anne's mismanagement wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was slow, confusing, and deeply human. She wasn't undone by betrayal, but by the absence of strong support and the burden of too much loss. The real scandal was that a woman with immense authority spent her reign surrounded by whisperers instead of equals. And yet even her messiest favoritism couldn't hold a candle to the royal disaster that came next. A scandal involving murder, missing nephews, and one of the most infamous unsolved disappearances in British history. Richard III may have only reigned for 2 years, but the shadow he cast has lingered for over 5 centuries. 12. Richard III, The Princes in the Tower. Debacle. If royal scandals were ranked by how much damage they do to a monarch's legacy, Richard III would sit comfortably in the top tier, clutching a crown and a very suspicious set of keys. His reign only lasted 2 years, but thanks to a pair of vanished nephews, he spent over 500 years being cast as British history's most infamous babysitter. The basics are grim and well-trodden. In 1483, King Edward IV died unexpectedly. His eldest son, Edward V, was only 12. As was custom, a Lord Protector was appointed to rule until the boy came of age. That role fell to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother, a seasoned military commander, and, for all appearances, a loyal uncle. For about 15 minutes, anyway. Within weeks, Richard had both young princes, Edward V and his 9-year-old brother, Richard, Duke of York, moved into the Tower of London. Officially, it was for their protection. Unofficially, it looked very much like a strategic relocation. The boys were next in line to the throne. They were also inconvenient. Richard moved quickly. He declared the princes illegitimate, claiming Edward IV's marriage to their mother was invalid. This cleared the path for him to be crowned king, which he was, in July 1483. as Richard III. The two boys, still tucked away in the tower, simply disappeared from public view. They were never seen again. This is where things get murky and incredibly dumb in that tragic, historical facepalm kind of way. If Richard III did have the boys killed, and let's be honest, most people believe he didn't do a great job of managing the optics. No public explanation, no confirmed burial, no convenient blame-shifting scapegoat. Just silence. The vacuum of information became its own scandal. Rumors bloomed. Whispers turned into full-on accusations. Shakespeare turned it into theater. It's important to remember that the Tower of London, despite its ominous reputation today, wasn't just a prison. It was also a royal residence and a place to safely house important people, like, say, two young royals whose claim to the throne could disrupt your brand new coronation. But as the years passed and no trace of the princes was ever found, the theory of murder solidified into popular consensus. Richard had motive, means, and access. He also had remarkably little finesse when it came to explaining himself. Worse still, the whole affair backfired politically. Far from cementing his rule, the disappearance of the princes eroded Richard's support. Nobles who might have stayed loyal began to distance themselves. The general public, uneasy and rumor-hungry, started seeing him as a villain. Even foreign powers were unsettled. Within 2 years, Henry Tudor, a relatively obscure Lancastrian claimant, raised an army, landed in Wales, and defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard was the last English king to die in battle. According to legend, his final words were, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." According to reality, he was probably trampled and left in a muddy ditch. His body was hastily buried and lost to history until 2012, when it was famously discovered under a parking lot in Leicester. Because even in death, Richard's story couldn't avoid ironic twists. But the real scandal isn't just that two boys disappeared. It's that Richard seemed to think no one would notice, that a quiet vanishing act would somehow cleanse the path to power. Instead, he became a historical cautionary tale. His name is synonymous with betrayal, fratricide, and cold ambition. Even when later evidence suggested he may not have been the villain Shakespeare painted, the damage was already done. The monarchy survived Richard, but barely. The Tudors took over and scrubbed the memory of the Plantagenets like an image-conscious PR team after a palace leak. Richard's reign was short, brutal, and defined by two missing boys, a scandal of silence that echoed louder than any spoken confession. And yet, in the centuries that followed, the royal family would develop a different kind of PR problem. Not silent disappearances, but awkward, unfiltered moments, the kind that start as casual remarks and end as tabloid headlines. Just ask the Queen Mother, whose offhand comments occasionally landed with the grace of a lead tiara. 13. Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother. PR embarrassments in pearls. The Queen Mother is often remembered as the twinkly-eyed matriarch of the British royal family, a human embodiment of hats, pearls, and soft-focused nostalgia. She lived through 2 world wars, raised a reluctant king, and survived long enough to see more prime ministers than most people see houseplants. But behind that affable exterior was a woman whose offhand remarks and public misreads occasionally landed like a champagne cork to the face. To be clear, the Queen Mother was no villain, but she was a product of her time, which, when you live to be over 100, includes a lot of outdated time periods. Her lifelong PR strategy was simple: smile often, say little, and always carry a handbag large enough to conceal any real opinion. Yet even with that cautious approach, she managed to spark more than a few palace headaches. Not with scandals in the modern sense, no leaks, no lawsuits, no headline-grabbing feuds, but with a series of gaffes that were avoidable, strangely timed, or just deeply tone-deaf. Let's start with her famously oblivious take on money. Raised in aristocratic comfort and married into monarchy, the Queen Mother seemed constitutionally incapable of understanding the concept of financial limits. She once described her household budget of several £1,000,000 as barely sufficient, and when asked about the cost of royal upkeep during a recession, reportedly remarked, "People are always so tiresome about money." It wasn't cruelty, it was detachment. The kind that comes from a life where bills are theoretical and someone else always irons the napkins. Then there were the public comments. The Queen Mother had an old-school, pre-media age sense of humor, wry, coded, and best kept behind velvet curtains. But in an age of journalists with notebooks and microphones, those quips often landed differently. Once, on a tour of the East End, she described the devastation of the Blitz as a great leveler, adding that it made us all equal. A stirring sentiment, until you remember she said it from a freshly polished Rolls-Royce on her way back to a palace. Even her war legacy, which is often revered, wasn't without its awkward moments. During World War II, she famously refused to leave London during the bombings, saying, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." It became a rallying cry of royal stoicism. But less quoted is her remark that being bombed made her feel closer to the people, which, again, is a noble idea, unless you're one of the people living in a flattened tenement while she sleeps behind 14th century walls. The Queen Mother also had a complicated relationship with modernity. She disliked television, distrusted the press, and once called the invention of central heating an unnecessary vulgarity. She reportedly believed the monarchy should remain above politics, above controversy, and if possible, above reality. This created a generational rift, particularly as younger royals embraced cameras, causes, and candidness. To the Queen Mum, accessibility was dangerous. Familiarity bred scandal. Better to wave from the carriage than speak from the podium. Her fashion sense, famously unchanged for 5 decades, didn't help. It made her look eternal, yes, but also fossilized. She became a symbol of everything the monarchy was afraid to leave behind: tradition, distance, and an unquestioned sense of entitlement. While Queen Elizabeth II evolved into a global stateswoman, the Queen Mother remained a walking postcard from an earlier age. Still, it's hard to truly dislike her. Her charm was real, if outdated. Her commitment to the crown was unwavering, even when she didn't quite understand what century she was in. But her presence always came with the risk of one too many port and tonics and an uncensored comment about how much nicer things were before all these dreadful modern ideas. In a way, she was the monarchy's grandmother figure, comforting, familiar, and occasionally embarrassing at family dinners. But for sheer defiance of royal protocol and PR logic, few matched the scandal magnetism of her niece, Princess Margaret, the original royal wild child who turned rebellion into an art form. 14. Princess Margaret, rebellious lifestyle scandal. If Queen Elizabeth II was duty in a tiara, Princess Margaret was defiance in diamonds. Born into privilege and bound by tradition, Margaret was the younger sister in a family that didn't do well with younger siblings, particularly ones with opinions, cigarettes, and an unshakable desire to live like a movie star in a system built for nuns. Her entire public life was a contradiction: a royal who wanted freedom, a woman raised in restraint who craved spectacle, and a tabloid magnate decades before social media ever existed. Margaret's scandal wasn't a single misstep. It was a lifestyle, curated, self-aware, and riddled with avoidable controversy. Where the Queen moved with quiet precision, Margaret blazed through post-war Britain like a designer hurricane, leaving gossip, admiration, and occasional disappointment in her wake. It all started with a love story. The first one, anyway. In the 1950s, Margaret fell deeply for Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated war hero, a divorcee, and, unfortunately, a man considered wholly inappropriate by the standards of royal protocol. Their relationship bloomed under the post-war glare of a nation still reverent of monarchy but increasingly fascinated by personal drama. Newspapers whispered, the public swooned, and the palace squirmed. At the time, the Church of England, helmed by Margaret's own sister, forbade royals from marrying divorcees. The Queen found herself in an impossible position, bound by law, church, and crown, and forced to tell her sister that love simply wasn't an option. Margaret was presented with a choice: abandon Townsend and retain her royal privileges, or marry him and effectively exile herself from royal life. After months of indecision, under intense public scrutiny, she gave in to duty and heartbreakingly announced that she would not marry him. That decision, widely interpreted as the end of a fairy tale, marked the beginning of something else entirely. Margaret's transformation from tragic romantic to tabloid sensation. Her later marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, was supposed to be modern. For a brief moment it was. They were fashionable, daring, and artistically adjacent. But the glamour couldn't conceal the cracks. Snowdon reportedly disliked the royal lifestyle. Margaret, in turn, found the artsy libertine scene charming until it became emotionally and publicly exhausting. Their marriage deteriorated into a cold war of affairs, resentment, and public sniping. A slow-burn disaster wrapped in silk and served at charity galas. By the 1970s, Margaret had settled into her reputation as the rebellious royal. She smoked relentlessly, drank freely, and vacationed with socialites, actors, and various men whose surnames the palace never quite learned to pronounce. Her most famous affair, with Roddy Llewellyn, a gardener and aspiring singer 17 years her junior, was splashed across front pages with all the subtlety of a fire alarm. Photographs of the pair lounging poolside in Mustique reached the Queen's desk before breakfast. What made Margaret's scandal so uniquely hers was the contrast. She was a royal, yes, but also a woman visibly chafing against the very system that defined her. Where others hid their affairs, Margaret let them simmer in public. Where others bit their tongues, she issued cutting remarks. She once described herself, half seriously, as a royal without a role, and in that vacuum she filled the space with controversy, parties, and deliberate provocation. The monarchy tried to manage her. They gave her titles, patronages, and speaking engagements. But Margaret never really fit into the model of the hard-working royal. She was too glamorous, too unpredictable, too disinterested in pretending she enjoyed cutting ribbons at factories. She loved opera, theater, and long lunches with people the rest of the family found embarrassing. In many ways, she lived the life the Queen couldn't, and paid for it in headlines and hushed conversations. Margaret's legacy is tangled. She's remembered as both cautionary tale and cult icon. To some, she was a failure of royal discipline. To others, she was the last truly aristocratic rebel, a woman trapped in a role that was always too small for her. But her rebellion was personal. The next scandal on the royal timeline came not from lifestyle, but from mourning. Because when Queen Victoria lost her beloved Albert, she didn't just grieve, she vanished. And her silence echoed far louder than any scandal ever could. 15. Queen Victoria. The royal wave to public resentment. After Albert's death, Queen Victoria ruled over an empire on which the sun never set, but after her husband Prince Albert died in 1861, the Queen herself all but disappeared into shadow. She became the widow of Windsor in more than name, retreating from public life, shrouding herself in black, and transforming a nation's grief into a deeply personal, oddly theatrical withdrawal that left Britain puzzled, then irritated, then outright resentful. To be fair, Victoria and Albert's marriage was unusually sincere by royal standards. Their partnership was intellectual, emotional, and, for a while, surprisingly modern. Albert was her advisor, her confidant, and in many ways, her compass. So when he died suddenly of what was believed to be typhoid fever, Victoria unraveled. It wasn't just mourning. It was identity collapse, and that part is understandable. What's less understandable, and more scandalous, in the way only royalty can manage, is how Victoria allowed her private grief to become a decades-long dereliction of public duty. Instead of appearing at official ceremonies, she stayed at Balmoral. Instead of comforting a nation that had lost its prince consort, she surrounded herself with servants, black lace, and memorial portraits. Entire years passed without her making a single public appearance. Parliament grew anxious. The press turned snide. The people, once deeply sympathetic, began to question whether their monarch had simply ghosted them. At a time when monarchy still relied on visibility, physical presence as a proxy for authority, Victoria's absence wasn't just unusual, it was destabilizing. Britain was undergoing seismic shifts: the rise of the working class, the spread of literacy, the slow democratization of power. The monarchy needed to adapt. And yet, at the center of it all was a queen who had essentially put the empire on voicemail. For a ruler who once commanded such devotion, Victoria's public silence became its own scandal. Not a juicy affair or financial recklessness, but something quieter and somehow worse: aloofness, detachment, the refusal to evolve. Even when she was persuaded to reappear, usually under significant pressure, the events felt ghostly. She would arrive draped in mourning black, gloved, veiled, and visibly uninterested. There was no royal wave, no emotional uplift, just the heavy presence of grief staged as pageantry. Behind the scenes, her affections transferred to John Brown, a blunt Scotsman and personal servant who became her closest companion, and, inevitably, the subject of court gossip. Brown was trusted more than most courtiers. He had access, influence, and a sense of familiarity that no palace advisor could replicate. Some called him the Queen's Highland Servant. Others whispered far more salacious titles. Whether the rumors were true or not, and history leans toward no, but not for lack of scandalous speculation, the relationship only further alienated Victoria from the stiff protocols of royal conduct. The resentment reached its peak in the 1870s, when public figures and newspapers openly criticized the Queen's invisibility. One MP famously asked, "Where is our monarch?" And it wasn't a rhetorical question. For many, it felt like the crown had become a phantom limb, still technically there, but no longer functional. Eventually, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli managed to coax her back into public life, partly through flattery, partly through political manipulation. He even got her to accept the title Empress of India, which came with grandeur, distraction, and a renewed sense of imperial purpose. Victoria, perhaps realizing she'd pushed the nation's patience to its limits, slowly resumed her ceremonial duties. But the damage lingered. Her retreat had rewritten the relationship between monarch and subject. It proved that personal sorrow, when wielded by someone in power, could become a national problem. And it left a legacy of complicated admiration. A monarch who ruled for 63 years, but spent a sizable portion of it mourning, moping, and avoiding eye contact with her own empire. Still, for all her emotional entanglements and ceremonial absences, Victoria maintained a certain imperial dignity. The same can't quite be said of her daughter-in-law, Queen Mary of Teck, whose dedication to royal protocol once caused more diplomatic confusion than clarity. Because when etiquette becomes a weapon, even the tea set starts looking suspicious. 16. Queen Mary of Teck. Royal etiquette gone wrong. Queen Mary of Teck looked like she'd been born inside a portrait frame and hadn't left it since. Regal, stoic, and decked out in jewels that could blind a small town, she was the very model of royal decorum. But for all her love of pearls, protocols, and polished silverware, Mary had one fatal flaw. She wielded etiquette like a sword, and occasionally forgot there were real people on the receiving end of it. Born in 1867, Mary wasn't originally destined for a crown. She was of noble blood, yes, but relatively modest by royal standards. Still, the family was broke. Aristocratically broke, which is to say, They had tiaras, but no money to heat the castle. And Mary was raised to marry well. She was intelligent, observant, and deeply trained in the art of royal manners. She could curtsy in her sleep. She understood which fork was for fish, which was for salad, and which was for silently judging the guests. Originally engaged to Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson and second in line to the throne, Mary's royal trajectory was nearly derailed when he died unexpectedly in 1892. In a move that can only be described as dynastic recycling, the family promptly redirected her engagement to his younger brother George, the future George V. Less than a year later, she was back on track, now betrothed to a man with fewer frills but more staying power. As queen consort, Mary embraced her role with something bordering on religious devotion. She believed in monarchy as an institution, not just a family business. Every handshake, every ribbon cutting, every glance at a flower arrangement was a performance, and she delivered it with near mechanical precision. But that obsessive adherence to royal protocol often produced results that were, let's say, socially questionable. She was notorious for visiting the homes of aristocrats and admiring their antiques so aggressively that they felt compelled to give them to her as gifts, not because they wanted to, but because it was understood. If Queen Mary stares at your vase for more than 5 seconds, congratulations. It now belongs to Buckingham Palace. This was so common that it became a running joke among the upper classes. Hide the silver. The Queen's coming. She also had a habit of correcting people's posture mid-conversation. If you slouched in her presence, she'd gently reposition your shoulders with the same grace you might use to adjust a crooked painting. It was well-intentioned, perhaps, but imagine being casually manhandled by someone in a diamond tiara while trying to explain your local charity initiative. Diplomatic receptions were no less nerve-wracking. Queen Mary expected everything, and everyone, to follow rules most people didn't even know existed. There's a story of her correcting a foreign dignitary's bow so precisely and publicly that the man reportedly canceled his return visit. She once refused to enter a room because the flag arrangements were incorrect. It didn't matter that the room was full of people waiting to meet her. Flags came first, faces came second. But perhaps the most absurd result of Mary's etiquette obsession was how it affected her own family. Her children were raised in an environment so rigid and emotionally reserved that even the future King George VI reportedly described her as cold and distant. She didn't mean harm. It simply never occurred to her that parental warmth was not outlined in the royal manual. Yet despite her quirks, Queen Mary was widely respected. She represented a kind of unshakable royal continuity. In times of war, scandal, and upheaval, she never blinked, never slouched, and never accepted less than the full royal treatment. She believed monarchy was theater, but serious theater, the kind where even the understudy gets silk gloves. Still, her insistence on perfection often left a trail of confusion, bruised egos, and antique theft by eye contact. And for all her composure, even Mary couldn't prevent the next royal embarrassment. A man with far less restraint, a flair for off-the-cuff remarks, and a talent for stepping directly into controversy with both polished shoes. Prince Philip, ever loyal, ever inappropriate, was about to redefine what it meant to speak before thinking. 17. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, gaffes and off-the-cuff. Comments. Prince Philip wasn't a scandal in the traditional tabloid exploding sense. He didn't vanish with a suitcase full of taxpayer cash. He didn't crash the monarchy into a constitutional crisis. What he did do, repeatedly, was open his mouth and detonate whatever diplomatic subtlety was hanging in the room. For over 7 decades as consort to Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip turned gaffes into an accidental subgenre of royal engagement. Part insult, part icebreaker, part verbal tripwire. And yet, for all the eye rolls and flustered palisades, it wasn't malevolence that made Philip a walking PR liability. It was the combination of blunt military sensibility, a generational disconnect the size of the British Empire, and a complete lack of interest in whether his jokes actually landed. The man simply didn't believe in sugarcoating, or filters, or pausing. Born in 1921, Philip was Greek-born, German-linked, raised in France, educated in Britain. A cocktail of displaced aristocracy and naval discipline. He married then Princess Elizabeth in 1947, and from the beginning struggled with the role of royal plus one. The monarchy offered him a life of service, but not much personal power. So he channeled his energy into modernization, environmental causes, military charities, and occasionally baffling one-liners that left diplomats sweating into their lapels. The list of his infamous remarks reads like a comedic time capsule from a less sensitive era. Some were minor lapses in judgment, others caused full-on international embarrassment. In 1986, on a trip to China, he told a group of British students, "If you stay here much longer, you'll all be slitty-eyed." It was a comment so tone-deaf that British officials reportedly apologized before the plane even touched back down. And yet Philip didn't so much apologize as move on, unbothered. Like a royal version of, well, that's just how I talk. He once asked an indigenous leader in Australia if they still chucked spears at each other. He told a British student in Papua New Guinea that she looked ready for bed because she was wearing traditional dress. He described smoke alarms as a damn nuisance during a visit to a fire-damaged building. These weren't deliberate provocations. They were what happens when you give a straight-talking naval officer a microphone and then act surprised when he uses it like a foghorn. But even within Britain, Philip's verbal misfires were the stuff of legend. He described a fuse box as looking like it was installed by an Indian. He advised a deaf child who played the drums that it was no wonder he couldn't hear. And when asked if he'd like to visit the Soviet Union, he reportedly replied, "I would like to go to Russia very much, although the bastards murdered half my family." Historically accurate, perhaps. Diplomatically useful? Less so. Yet somehow, despite the decades of wince-inducing commentary, Philip remained largely immune to cancellation. In part, it was his age. He was seen as a relic of a stiffer, pre-apology age. In part, it was loyalty. Philip never wavered in his support of the Queen. His public awkwardness was balanced by his tireless work behind the scenes. Over 22,000 solo engagements, hundreds of charitable causes, and a quiet but serious role in modernizing the image of the royal family from dusty relic to semi-functioning institution. And let's be honest, some of his gaffes were funny. Awful, yes, but also wrapped in that dry, unintentional comedy that only happens when someone says exactly the wrong thing with perfect confidence. He wasn't trying to shock. He just didn't care much for small talk, or the ever-tightening rules of public speech. Still, his off-the-cuff legacy left a tricky inheritance. Because while Philip's remarks were mostly brushed off as generational quirks, the next scandal on the list didn't have the luxury of nostalgia. It came from a royal woman who broke the mold long before Meghan ever arrived, a free-spirited daughter of Queen Victoria whose behavior ignited courtly panic long before the press had cameras. Princess Louise didn't just bend the rules, she reshaped them. 18. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Royal free-spirited behavior scandal. In a royal family obsessed with duty, silence, and staying inside the lines, Princess Louise was the kind of daughter who painted on the walls and then asked why no one else had tried it. Born in 1848 to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Louise was the sixth of 9 children. But while most of her siblings marched through royal life like obedient little tin soldiers, Louise broke ranks. She wasn't scandalous in the usual ways. No dramatic abdications, no tell-all interviews. Instead, her scandal came from simply wanting to live like a normal, thinking, passionate person. And in the Victorian royal family, that was practically treason. Louise was artistic, fiercely intelligent, and reportedly the most beautiful of Victoria's daughters, though she didn't seem all that interested in becoming a decorative royal asset. She was interested in sculpture, in politics, in independence. and she didn't shy away from saying so. Her family, of course, hated it. Victoria believed that royal daughters should be dutiful, domestic, and above all, quiet. Preferably married off to German princes and never heard from again. But Louise had other plans. She became the first British royal to attend a public art school, the National Art Training School in South Kensington, where she studied sculpture and later had her work exhibited publicly. One of her most famous pieces, a statue of Queen Victoria, still stands outside Kensington Palace today, a literal monument to a royal who dared to use her hands for something other than waving. Naturally, the court was horrified. A princess, chiseling marble, taking commissions, associating with artists, many of them male, unroyal, and deeply bohemian. It was all too much. Rumors swirled, some suggesting affairs with instructors, others with fellow students. There's never been hard proof of anything untoward, but the mere idea that Louise might be engaging in normal human relationships outside the palace walls was enough to spark waves of palace anxiety. Her marriage, when it finally came, didn't exactly silence the whispers. Rather than marry a foreign royal, as expected, Louise chose John Campbell, the Marquis of Lorne, a British aristocrat and future Duke of Argyll. This made her the first daughter of a monarch to marry a non-royal in over 3 centuries. Queen Victoria allowed it, reluctantly, but the match was always a little awkward. Lorne was intellectual and progressive, like Louise, but their relationship never quite settled into happiness. There were no children, which at the time only fueled speculation about incompatibility, and inevitably unsubstantiated gossip about Lorne's preferences and Louise's frustrations. Despite the coolness of her marriage, Louise continued to live on her own terms. She supported women's education, remained active in artistic circles, and pushed boundaries without shouting about it. She was, in many ways, a prototype for the modern royal, involved, independent, and mildly terrifying to the establishment. Yet for all her progressiveness, the court never quite figured out what to do with her. She was too royal to be dismissed, too rebellious to be trusted, and too competent to be sidelined. Her siblings regarded her with a mix of admiration and bafflement. Queen Victoria, in her letters, swings between loving concern and absolute exasperation. Princess Louise didn't destroy royal tradition, she just refused to be crushed by it. Her scandal wasn't explosive, but quiet and constant, a steady drip of defiance in a palace built on obedience. Still, if Louise's rule-breaking lifestyle ruffled feathers, the next monarch on our list lit a bonfire under the entire rulebook. Because King Charles II didn't just tolerate scandal, he thrived in it. Mistresses, masquerades, illegitimate children. Charles didn't court respectability. He hosted it, then left it outside in the rain. 19. King Charles II. Whimsical scandals of the merry monarch. There's a difference between a scandal that happens to a monarch and a scandal that a monarch invites to dinner. King Charles II, affectionately known as the Merry Monarch, didn't just tolerate public mischief, he turned it into statecraft. If his court had a motto, it might have been something like, "If it's not outrageous, it's not worth doing." After 11 years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell, a period best described as a national experiment in fun deprivation, Charles returned from exile in 1660 and brought with him a royal restoration that felt like a centuries-late Mardi Gras. Suddenly, England had a king again, and that king wanted art, music, theater, wine, and more mistresses than a historical novel with no editor. But Charles wasn't all party tricks and powdered wigs. He was clever, charismatic, and politically shrewd, which is what made his behavior all the more baffling. He knew how power worked. He understood perception. And yet he repeatedly, gleefully, sabotaged his own image by embracing scandals with the same enthusiasm most monarchs reserved for opening parliament. Start with the women. Charles had at least a dozen known mistresses, from the famously witty Barbara Villiers to the French actress Louise de Querouaille, to the orange seller-turned Duchess Nell Gwynn. Each of these women caused varying levels of court gossip and political strain, especially since Charles tended to reward them with land, titles, and influence, often in full view of a parliament already skeptical of his spending habits. By the end of his reign, he had fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children, all acknowledged, many ennobled, none legitimate. One of his favorites, Nell Gwyn, was beloved by the public for her sharp tongue and low-born origins. Once, when her coach was mistaken for that of one of Charles's other mistresses, the unpopular Catholic Louise, and mobbed by an angry Protestant crowd, Nell reportedly leaned out the window and shouted, "Good people, I am the Protestant whore." It worked. The crowd cheered. Even the king probably laughed. The irony? Charles had no legitimate heirs. His wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. She remained devoted to him despite his parade of lovers, and he, to his credit, refused to divorce her, though mostly out of political convenience rather than marital affection. But the women were only part of the circus. Charles also delighted in subverting expectations. He founded the Royal Society, championed scientific thought, and supported writers like John Dryden, all while treating the business of governance as something to be wedged between masquerade balls and private suppers. He once famously turned up late to a Privy Council meeting because he was feeding his spaniels. The dogs came with him. Even his deathbed was, in its own way, scandalous. Dying in 1685 after a sudden illness, Charles supposedly used his last breaths to apologize for being such a long time dying, and to urge his brother James to take care of his mistresses. In other words, no regrets, just requests. What made Charles's scandals so unique was their sheer theatricality. There was no shame, no cover-up. He made no effort to hide his excesses, which paradoxically endeared him to a public exhausted by decades of Puritanism. His charm insulated him from full-scale public backlash, but not from history's amused side-eye. Charles II left behind no legitimate heirs and no royal legacy in the traditional sense. But he left England with something arguably more memorable, the blueprint for how to turn a monarchy into a stage show. His reign was a performance, and he played the lead with velvet and verve. Still, even Charles's glittering chaos had its limits. His son, unofficially that is, would grow up to become Edward VII, a man who would turn princely misbehavior into a near-professional sport. Because when it came to leisure, affairs, and scandalous spending, Edward didn't just follow in his father's footsteps. He built an entire royal racetrack on them. 20. Edward VII, Albert Edward. The rake prince turned King Edward VII didn't earn his nickname, Bertie, through affection alone. It was also a way of softening the blow of having a prince who, for most of his life, seemed deeply allergic to responsibility. As the eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Bertie was born to rule, but he spent the better part of 6 decades doing absolutely everything else. Before he became king, Edward VII was best known for 3 things: overeating, overspending, and over-romancing. He was the classic Victorian study in contradictions, a future monarch raised under the cold, intellectual eye of Prince Albert and the suffocating emotional control of Queen Victoria. She wanted him to be morally upright and academically exceptional. He wanted to go to Paris and gamble in velvet trousers. And he did, often. By the time he reached adulthood, Edward's reputation was already badly bruised. His military career was perfunctory, his academic career non-existent, and his romantic escapades prolific. He was, in effect, the first British royal to become a fully fledged tabloid figure before the tabloids even existed. His affairs were legendary and frequent, with actresses, aristocrats, courtesans, and at least one high society madame. None of it was secret. In fact, Bertie seemed to prefer it when people noticed. One of the more publicized affairs was with Lily Langtry, a famous actress whose intelligence and beauty made her a darling of the London elite. Another was Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, who later became a socialist and wrote memoirs that confirmed what everyone already suspected. Bertie didn't deny these relationships. He attended their parties, stayed in their homes, and sometimes vacationed with their husbands. It was not discretion that saved him. It was immunity by volume. He also had a gambling problem, or more precisely, a gambling lifestyle. Baccarat, horse racing, cards, anything that allowed him to place large bets with borrowed money. His debts were astonishing, prompting Queen Victoria to publicly lament that she did not know what to do with Bertie. The Prince of Wales lived like a man determined to avoid the throne entirely, and for a while it looked like he might succeed. But then, in 1901, Queen Victoria finally passed away after a reign so long it made Edward's wait seem like a form of slow-motion punishment. When Bertie finally became King Edward VII at age 59, the general consensus was that Britain was about to receive the most frivolous, self-indulgent monarch it had ever known. Instead, something strange happened. Edward VII turned out to be capable. He was charming, tactful, and surprisingly good at diplomacy. He maintained Europe's fragile peace through a web of personal relationships, spoke several languages, and understood the value of soft power before the term even existed. His reign, known as the Edwardian era, was brief but culturally transformative, a final flourish before the world marched into the Great War. Still, his personal reputation never quite escaped the shadow of his pre-kingly life. Political cartoonists drew him with oversized waistlines and trailing mistresses. Court gossip followed him like a secondary crown. He was the king who could walk into a tailor's shop, order a dozen suits, and forget to pay for half of them. His favorite pastime was dining, 7-course meals, 4 times a day. He once ordered a custom dining chair with a wider seat, just to accommodate his royal leisure. Edward VII died in 1910, and was succeeded by his more reserved, more traditional son, George V. But his legacy lingered, a man who lived like a scandal and ruled like a statesman. Still, while Bertie's reputation was salvaged by late-blooming competence, not all royals were so lucky. Some seemed born to stumble. Like Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, whose legacy remains less scandalous and more deeply puzzling, defined not by defiance but by a long list of bewildering missteps that history can't quite explain, but definitely couldn't ignore. 21. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, lesser known but ridiculously avoidable errors. In the pantheon of royal embarrassment, not every scandal involves a love triangle, a leaked phone call, or a Nazi handshake. Some are subtler, quieter, almost boring, until you realize they were entirely avoidable and somehow still managed to unfold like an aristocratic blooper reel. Such is the legacy of Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, a royal who didn't seek out scandal, but managed to trip into it anyway, repeatedly, as though Buckingham Palace had been coated in banana peels. Born in 1900, Prince Henry was the third son of King George V and Queen Mary, making him the younger brother of both Edward VIII, of abdication fame, and George VI, of reluctant hero fame. Where his older brothers were either dramatically flawed or accidentally heroic, Henry simply existed, quietly, dutifully, occasionally in the wrong place at the worst possible time. He was trained for military life and spent his early years in the army, where his most notable contribution was managing to maintain his anonymity in an institution where saluting the wrong superior could cause a week of national headlines. When duty called, Henry showed up. Unfortunately, so did his tendency to become tangled in public relations puzzles. Let's start with his 1935 visit to Germany, 1 year before Edward VIII would take his own, infamously ill-timed Nazi tour. Henry's visit was officially sanctioned, meant to promote Anglo-German friendship, which, to be fair, was still a fashionable political illusion in the mid-1930s. But while Edward's tour included awkward photo ops with Hitler, Henry's diplomatic foray mostly featured unintentionally humiliating moments of political tone deafness, such as saluting alongside German officers during a military parade. The image of a British prince offering anything resembling a salute next to a swastika wasn't exactly a confidence booster for a Europe tiptoeing toward disaster. But it wasn't just international gaffes. Henry's career was filled with domestic oddities too. Perhaps the most baffling of all was his time as Governor-General of Australia, a job he accepted in 1944, right in the middle of World War II. On paper, this was a noble appointment, a royal stepping in to act as the Crown's representative in a Commonwealth country. In practice, it was a royal mess. The Australian government wasn't particularly enthusiastic, nor, it seemed, was Prince Henry. He arrived with little understanding of Australia's politics or cultural mood, and even less patience for the endless ceremonial duties. His speeches were stilted, his presence distant, and his impact largely negligible. There were even rumors that he had been chosen precisely because no one else wanted the job, not even other royals. His tenure was so underwhelming that many Australians quietly questioned whether the monarchy even understood their country at all. And to make matters worse, Henry accidentally confirmed those suspicions. At one point he gave a speech that appeared to confuse the names of Australian officials, and later made an offhand remark that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how the government functioned. The press, usually deferential to royalty, raised eyebrows. The public shrugged. He was, as one journalist put it, a man who looked like he'd been dropped here without a map. Even his private life carried a kind of genteel awkwardness. His marriage to Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott was steady but staid. His children, though largely kept out of the spotlight, carried the burden of a surname more famous for other people's drama. Henry himself never seemed to enjoy public life. He was shy, stiff, and prone to nervous silences in official settings. At receptions, he often hovered like someone waiting for a taxi that never came. His legacy? A man born to be royal who never quite figured out what to do with it. He didn't rebel. He didn't reform. He simply drifted from duty to duty, always slightly miscast, like a stage actor trapped in the wrong play. But perhaps the most British aspect of Prince Henry's royal tenure was this. For all his blunders and blank stares, he was considered loyal. He didn't cause a crisis. He caused a low-level, ongoing sense of confusion. He was a royal placeholder, someone who reminded the public that even within the House of Windsor, not everyone gets a dramatic arc. Some just get assigned a sash, handed a speech, and hope the microphone doesn't turn on too early. And yet, even Henry's bewildering missteps pale in comparison to the strange, almost comedic irrelevance of another royal by marriage. A man who made history by doing almost nothing right, and yet left behind a bureaucratic trail of noble-sounding titles and polite chaos. Meet Prince George of Denmark, consort to Queen Anne, whose royal career might be the least effective but somehow most fascinating non-scandal in the entire monarchy. 22. Prince George of Denmark. Ill-fated role, awkward overshadowing, and patronage mess. In the vast collection of British royal missteps, there are scandals so explosive they change the monarchy forever. And then there are the quieter disasters, the ones that unfold like a series of polite errors, barely noticed at first, until they snowball into a legacy of awkward irrelevance. Prince George of Denmark, the husband of Queen Anne, belongs firmly in the latter category. He was not a criminal, a rebel, or even particularly scandalous in the conventional sense. But his entire career as royal consort was marked by confusion, misalignment, and the kind of just why that history books usually reserve for footnotes. Let's start at the beginning. Not because it's particularly dramatic, but because that's as good a place as any to explain how a man managed to hold a powerful position while making virtually no impression. George was born in 1653, the younger son of the King of Denmark. He was Protestant, mildly noble, and reasonably well-connected, which made him politically useful, if not terribly exciting. When it came time for Princess Anne, future Queen Anne, of England to marry, George was selected as a safe Protestant choice. Safe, it turns out, is not always synonymous with effective. Anne and George married in 1683, and by most accounts, their personal relationship was affectionate and functional. George was loyal, unambitious, and happy to remain in the background. A rare trait in a royal consort. Unfortunately, that's exactly what made his role problematic. Britain wasn't used to having a male consort who wasn't the king. George didn't rule. He didn't lead the military. He wasn't involved in major policy decisions. And yet, because he was a man in a royal marriage during an era of immense political turbulence, people expected him to do something. He didn't. Or rather, he tried, and it didn't go well. His most notable appointment was as Lord High Admiral, a title that sounds impressive until you realize it's mostly ceremonial unless you actually know something about the Navy. George did not. His tenure was marked by poor strategic oversight and an almost total reliance on subordinates. After a few years of what could charitably be described as benign neglect, the position was quietly taken away from him. Politicians often disagreed over what to do with him. Some saw him as a potential Protestant figurehead in the ever-shifting chess game between Tories and Whigs. Others dismissed him as deadweight. Even Queen Anne's own ministers struggled to agree on whether he should be given influence or kept as ornamental wallpaper. The result was a man who attended meetings, nodded along, and left no trace. His speeches were short, his opinions vague, and his impact almost mathematically negligible. But the real irony is that while George remained publicly neutral, his very presence at Anne's side became a problem. As her reign progressed, Anne was surrounded by a rotating cast of fiercely ambitious courtiers, including the infamous rivalry between Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and Abigail Masham. In these power struggles, George played no role, but his silence became symbolic. People began to view him not as a neutral figure, but as an inert one, someone who, by failing to intervene, allowed chaos to thrive. It didn't help that his health declined rapidly in the early 1700s. He suffered from asthma, dropsy, now known as edema, and general ill health that kept him out of public life for long stretches. By the time of his death in 1708, he had become more a rumor than a presence. His funeral was dutiful but subdued. Queen Anne mourned him deeply, and privately. But the political world moved on almost instantly, as though a chair had been vacated that no one remembered sitting in the first place. So why does Prince George matter? Because he represents a very specific kind of royal mistake. The ceremonial appointment of someone who had no real function, no clear identity, and no instinct for navigating the ruthless world of royal politics. His scandal wasn't personal failure. It was structural irrelevance. And in a family where irrelevance can sometimes be more dangerous than rebellion, that's a legacy worth noting. George wasn't despised. He was worse. He was forgettable. But forgettable isn't contagious, not in the way chaos is. For that, we need to look outside the royal bloodline to a woman who managed to scandalize society with such flair, the royals themselves became collateral damage. Lady Caroline Lamb wasn't a monarch. She wasn't even quite royal. But she proved, with manic poetry and a broken heart, that sometimes the most volatile figure in the room isn't wearing a crown, just a very well-placed dagger of wit. 23. Lady Caroline Lamb. Affair with Byron and public meltdown. Lady Caroline Lamb wasn't technically a royal, but she was close enough to singe the monarchy when she set herself on fire. Metaphorically, of course, though with her temperament, it wouldn't have been entirely out of the question. Born into privilege, married into aristocracy, and moving within circles that fed the royal machine, Lady Caroline didn't need a crown to cause damage. She had wealth, proximity, literary flair, and perhaps most dangerously of all, emotional instability in a society that politely pretended it didn't exist. At the center of her spiral is her affair with the poet Lord Byron, a man described by one contemporary as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Caroline, famously, would be the one to coin that phrase. It was equal parts admiration and prophecy. She entered the affair like a romantic heroine. She exited it like a live wire. Let's back up. Caroline was married to William Lamb, who would later become Viscount Melbourne, and eventually Queen Victoria's Prime Minister. But in the early 1800s, their marriage was already showing cracks. Caroline, brilliant and volatile, chafed under the expectations of noble womanhood. She wrote poetry. She hosted salons. She defied etiquette. And then Byron appeared, the glittering, brooding, scandal-drenched poet whose reputation was already questionable. They collided like thunder and flint. For Byron, it may have been a brief dalliance. For Caroline, it was a soul-consuming obsession. Their affair was explosive, dramatic, and, crucially, public. Letters were exchanged, many of them florid and wildly inappropriate. She wrote verses, he mocked them. She sent hair, he returned sarcasm. After a few months, Byron tired of her emotional intensity and moved on. Caroline, unfortunately, did not. What followed was a series of escalating public meltdowns that might have been funny if they weren't so tragic. Caroline stalked him. She wrote furious letters. She threatened self-harm, and occasionally faked it for attention. At one point, she famously attended a ball dressed as a page boy, carrying a dagger and a glass of blood-colored wine, just to make a scene. Subtlety was not her strong suit. Society, predictably, turned against her. Women whispered, men gossiped. Her family begged her to stop. Her husband tolerated her antics with increasing discomfort, knowing full well that her behavior reflected not just on him, but on the larger aristocratic network he was part of, including indirectly the monarchy. And this is where Caroline's scandal becomes royally relevant. William Lamb was close to the crown. His political future was tightly wound with the establishment. And Caroline's chaos threatened all of it. She wasn't just embarrassing herself. She was drawing attention to the fragile, curated illusion of upper-class stability, something the monarchy relied on to maintain its image. A woman unraveling in public was dangerous enough. A woman doing it from inside a drawing room full of dukes? That was a national concern. Eventually, Caroline was socially exiled. She was forced to leave London and retreated into a world of nervous illness, increasingly erratic writing, and private isolation. Her novel, Glenarvan, a thinly veiled revenge fantasy in which a dashing aristocratic poet destroys a woman's life, was both a bestseller and a warning shot. Everyone knew it was about Byron. Everyone knew it came from pain. And everyone, including the royal family, distanced themselves as quickly as decorum allowed. Caroline died young, in 1828, at just 42, after years of declining health and psychological torment. Her legacy remains one of brilliance marred by instability, of talent undone by obsession. But more than anything, she served as a mirror for the era's contradictions. How women were expected to be both passionate and restrained, visible and invisible, admired and silent. The monarchy never spoke of her publicly. She was, like many difficult women in history, filed away under unfortunate incidents. But her impact lingered. She forced society to reckon with its own hypocrisy. And for a royal establishment that preferred its scandals to be clean, quiet, and easily forgotten, Lady Caroline Lamb was the kind of unpredictable storm they had no idea how to contain. Yet if Caroline's scandal was one of emotional recklessness, the next is a case study in cold, calculated foolishness. A young queen whose impulsive behavior wasn't driven by heartbreak or art, but by a dangerous mix of arrogance and ignorance. Catherine Howard didn't just break the rules. She ignored all the warnings, walked straight into history's trap, and never walked out. 24. Catherine Howard, young queen with reckless behavior. In the long parade of Tudor drama, where beheadings and betrayals were as common as banquets, Catherine Howard still manages to stand out, not for cunning or cruelty, but for sheer, tragic recklessness. The fifth wife of Henry VIII, Catherine was barely out of her teens when she married the aging, volatile king. And though her story often reads like a cautionary fairy tale, it's really more of a facepalm-inducing slow-motion disaster, the kind of scandal that unfolds in full view, despite every possible warning. By the time Catherine entered Henry's orbit in 1540, he was bloated, irritable, and prone to injury. His fourth marriage, to Anne of Cleves, had ended in a humiliating annulment. His mood was foul, his leg was ulcerated, his ego was bruised, and along came Catherine, young, charming, and significantly less politically threatening than her predecessors. To Henry, she was a balm. To everyone else, she was a time bomb with earrings. Catherine was a member of the ambitious Howard family, a clan that had already produced one queen, Anne Boleyn, and apparently hadn't learned a thing from the experience. Catherine was raised under the loose supervision of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in what could generously be called a morally flexible household. Her early years were marked by flirtations and, as later investigations would reveal, full-blown affairs with two men, her music tutor, Henry Mannix, and a young courtier named Francis Derham. None of this would have mattered much, except for the small detail that she forgot to stop the romantic entanglements once she became queen. Catherine married Henry in 1540, at around 17 years old, while he was nearly 50. The public celebrated the match, grateful to see the king smiling again, and unaware that the new queen had brought with her not just youth, but also a paper trail of ill-advised relationships, carelessly concealed and recklessly continued. At first, Catherine played the role beautifully. She was affectionate, lively, and attentive to Henry's moods. He, in turn, called her his rose without a thorn. But the thorns arrived quickly. Within months of her coronation, rumors began circulating that Catherine had rekindled a relationship with Derham, who had conveniently been appointed to her household. Even worse, another man, Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber, was soon added to the mix. Their alleged secret meetings were facilitated by Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother, as if the entire cast of past Tudor disasters had decided to reunite for one last tragic performance. Despite the tightening noose of suspicion, Catherine behaved as though she were untouchable. Notes were passed. Midnight visits arranged. The court whispered. Henry remained oblivious, until a letter arrived detailing Catherine's premarital indiscretions, signed and delivered by Archbishop Cranmer himself. The fallout was swift and brutal. Henry, enraged and humiliated, couldn't believe his young bride had betrayed him, not just in private, but in a way that mocked his already fragile masculinity and aging body. Catherine was arrested, denied a formal trial, and stripped of her title. Her panic in the face of imprisonment was reportedly so intense that she had to be forcibly restrained. When she learned that her execution was inevitable, she asked to have the block brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head on it. She was executed on 13th February 1542, not yet 20 years old. Catherine's scandal wasn't just her infidelity, it was her apparent inability to grasp the stakes. Whether due to naivety, arrogance, or simply the invincibility of youth, she behaved as though the rules didn't apply to her. In a court where alliances were measured in blood and survival depended on discretion, she acted like she was in a romantic drama. She wasn't. She was in the Tudor court. And in that setting, love was dangerous, but carelessness was fatal. Her downfall served as a final bitter echo of the Howard family's overreach and the monarchy's growing paranoia. Even Henry, who had seen plenty of scandals by that point, was reportedly shaken by the speed and depth of her betrayal. Catherine's brief reign became a symbol of foolish ambition, poor judgment, and the kind of avoidable tragedy that only the royals seemed to perfect. Yet even Catherine's downfall, scandalous as it was, pales in sheer peculiar absurdity next to her sister in infamy, Mary Boleyn. Because if Catherine was reckless, Mary was something else entirely, an opportunist whose proximity to power made her a footnote in history. And yet somehow, Her choices created echoes that would shape the future of the throne itself. 25. Mary Boleyn, affair with the king's daughter, and everything else. History has a way of prioritizing the loudest characters, the rebels, the queens, the martyrs, the tyrants. Mary Boleyn was none of those things. She wasn't particularly ambitious, nor historically clever, nor politically gifted. Yet her life, mostly spent in the wings of Tudor drama, was filled with enough awkwardness, missteps, and romantic entanglements to qualify as a royal scandal in slow motion. Not dramatic enough to warrant her own opera, but far too messy to ignore. Born around 1499 into the Boleyn family, a rising noble house with sharp elbows and social ambitions, Mary grew up in the glittering but dangerous world of Tudor court politics. She was the elder sister of Anne Boleyn, future queen and future cautionary tale, which already positioned her within reach of power and the many headaches that came with it. But long before Anne's head met the block, Mary made her own way into the royal spotlight, specifically the king's bed. By the 1520s, Mary had reportedly become King Henry VIII's mistress. The affair itself isn't unusual. Henry collected mistresses like ceremonial daggers. What is unusual is how little Mary seemed to gain from it. Unlike Anne, who would later engineer her way into a crown and then into the Tower, Mary received no titles, no lands, and barely a whisper of political capital from the liaison. Some historians speculate she may have borne the king a child, or even two, but no formal acknowledgement was ever made. That, too, was a scandal of sorts. A royal affair so ambiguous that it left a trail of genealogical confusion still debated by historians today. Mary's love life continued to spiral in directions that were, if not scandalous in the traditional sense, certainly embarrassing for a family trying to rise through the ranks. She married William Carey, a courtier and close friend of the king, which should have secured her position. Instead, Carey died young, leaving Mary financially strained and socially adrift. And then came her boldest and dumbest move yet, a second marriage, this time for love. That sounds romantic. Until you realize she married without permission, and not just anyone, but William Stafford, a low-ranking soldier with no money, no titles, and no political usefulness whatsoever. This was the Tudor equivalent of eloping with your Uber driver during a coronation. The Boleyn family, riding high on Anne's influence at court, was horrified. Mary was banished, cut off financially. Her sister, now queen, refused to receive her. But here's the thing about Mary Boleyn. She didn't seem to care. She faded into quiet domestic life, possibly the first and only Boleyn to realize that peace and obscurity might be preferable to dying in a palace intrigue. Still, the irony of Mary's story lies in how close she came to the center of power, and how repeatedly she misplayed her hand. She was a mistress to a king, sister to a queen, aunt to a future monarch, Elizabeth I, and yet she remains a historical footnote, remembered more for missed opportunities than anything else. That alone is scandalous in a system where legacy is everything. Even the rumors that she had an affair with the king before his marriage to Anne, and that she may have borne him a son, cast a shadow of moral awkwardness. It didn't help that some sources also linked her to Francois I of France during her teenage years abroad, where she reportedly gained a reputation that followed her back to England like bad perfume. Whether it's true or exaggerated, the nickname, the English Mare, attributed to her time at the French court, certainly didn't elevate her standing. Mary Boleyn's scandal, then, wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about a pattern of them, each one manageable, but collectively forming a portrait of a woman perpetually just on the edge of power, unable or unwilling to play the game required to stay there. She wasn't destroyed by ambition. She was eclipsed by it, first by her sister, then by the system itself. And so we end with her, a royal adjacent, a background character in a drama she could never quite direct. Not tragic, not triumphant, just tangled, awkward, and endlessly avoidable. Which really might be the perfect ending for this list. Because if there's one thing every scandal here has in common, it's that it didn't have to happen. But it did. Repeatedly. Spectacularly. And often, with a level of foolishness that defies belief, decorum, and the collective memory of 1,000 years of monarchy.